The snow came down like the sky itself had given up, thick and merciless and absolute, and Micah Wallace rode straight into the heart of it because he had nowhere else left to go. It was December of 1878, and the Wyoming Territory had decided that this particular winter would be the one that separated the living from the dead with ruthless efficiency. Micah had been riding for 3 days through the kind of cold that seeped through leather and wool and skin, and settled somewhere deep in a man's bones like a permanent tenant. His horse, a broad-chested roan gelding named Calder, had been slowing for the last 6 hours, and Micah could feel the animal's exhaustion in the increasingly labored rhythm beneath him. He himself was not doing much better. His fingers inside his gloves had gone from painful to numb sometime around noon, and the numbness felt, in a treacherous sort of way, like mercy. He had left Cheyenne 3 weeks ago with the intention of reaching the small settlement of Harlow Creek before winter truly set in. That plan had unraveled with the spectacular completeness that tended to characterize everything in Micah's life since the autumn. His partner of 6 years, a cattleman named Dale Prout, had cheated him out of their shared cattle operation in a land dispute that had been settled quickly and dishonestly by a territorial judge who Dale happened to have been schoolmates with back in Ohio. Micah had walked away from that courthouse with $32, a horse, a bedroll, and a Winchester rifle that needed a new firing pin. Everything else, the land, the cattle, the small house he had spent 2 winters building with his own hands, had been signed over in ink that still felt like a wound. He had not had much of a plan since then, which was how he found himself on the eastern slope of the Laramie Mountains during what the old-timers in Cheyenne had called, with gleeful grimness, the worst winter in 20 years. Calder stumbled, caught himself, and Micah pulled the horse to a slow stop. He leaned forward and patted the animal's neck, and even through his glove he could feel the trembling in the horse's muscles, the kind of tired that went all the way through. They needed shelter, not eventually. Right now. Micah raised his eyes against the driving snow and tried to read the landscape the way he had learned to over 15 years of working cattle through mountains and plains. There was a dark mass maybe a quarter mile ahead, something that broke the flat white horizon, and it took him a long moment to understand through his cold, dulled mind that it was a structure. A building, low and solid and made of logs, with a thin thread of smoke rising from one end and being immediately destroyed by the wind. He did not think too hard about whose building it was or whether he was welcome. He pressed his heels gently into Calder's sides, and the horse moved forward with what felt like the last of its willing heart. The building resolved itself as he drew closer into a homestead, modest but well-constructed, with a proper barn set some 20 yards back from the main cabin, and a split-rail fence that marked out a yard that the snow had done its level best to erase entirely. There was a covered porch on the south face of the cabin, and on that porch sat a stack of firewood that someone had stacked with the kind of deliberate care that spoke of a person who understood how long winter was and how much wood it required. Micah rode to the barn first, because that was the right thing to do, to see to his horse before he saw to himself. He slid down from the saddle, and his legs nearly went out from under him when his boots hit the ground. He grabbed Calder's bridle and stood for a moment with his forehead pressed against the horse's neck, just breathing, letting his legs remember what they were for. He got the barn door open with some difficulty, the latch nearly frozen shut, and led Calder inside. The relative warmth hit him like a physical thing. There were 2 stalls already occupied, a sturdy bay mare and what appeared to be a brown and white milk cow, both of which regarded Calder and Micah with the mild interest of animals in a warm place who found outsiders more curious than threatening. There was hay, proper stacked hay, not the wet trampled kind, and a water trough that had been broken through its ice crust recently enough that it was still mostly liquid. Micah unsaddled Calder with clumsy frozen fingers, got the horse into the empty 3rd stall, threw down a generous portion of hay, and made sure the animal had access to water. He stood for a moment looking at Calder in the stall, and there was something in his chest that was uncomfortably close to gratitude, that this particular animal had trusted him enough to keep going when a lesser horse might have simply stopped. Then he turned and walked to the cabin. He knocked. He knocked properly, 3 solid knocks on the door, because a man arriving at someone's home in a blizzard without an invitation was already asking enough without also helping himself inside without announcement. For a moment there was nothing, and then there was movement behind the door, the sound of footsteps that were neither heavy nor light but somewhere in between, purposeful, and then the door opened. The woman standing in the doorway was perhaps 25, with dark brown hair that she had pinned up in a way that suggested it had started the day neat and been partially dismantled by whatever she had been doing before he knocked. She was wearing a work dress in deep blue wool and a heavy canvas apron, and there was a dusting of flour on her forearm that she had apparently not noticed. Her eyes were brown, a shade of brown that in good light Micah suspected would lean toward amber, and they were looking at him with an expression that was not afraid, but was also not entirely without caution. It was the expression of a woman who had learned to assess situations quickly and act on that assessment with confidence. Behind her, filling the entire cabin with a smell so particular and so achingly ordinary that it hit Micah somewhere deep and unexpected, was the smell of coffee. Not the thin, weak coffee of trail camps made from grounds used twice over, but real coffee, dark and strong and freshly made, the kind that announced itself from 10 feet away. "You look like you're about to fall over," she said, and her voice was direct, low for a woman, and carried no particular alarm in it, just observation. "Yes, ma'am," Micah said, because it was true and he saw no reason to argue with accurate assessments of his condition. "I apologize for arriving without warning. My horse needed shelter, and I followed the smoke." She studied him for a moment longer, that brown gaze moving over him with the thoroughness of someone cataloging what they were dealing with. Then she stepped back from the door. "Come in," she said. "You can take your boots off there on the left side of the door. The floor is clean." Micah stepped inside and she closed the door behind him, and the warmth of the cabin surrounded him like something he had forgotten was possible. There was a cast-iron stove against the far wall putting out serious heat, a table with 2 chairs, a narrow bed built into an alcove, shelves with provisions, and a workbench that held evidence of several ongoing projects in the organized chaos of someone who lived alone and used every available surface. And there on the stove, sitting on a trivet beside the heat, was a blue enamel coffee pot, patient and steaming. Micah bent down to deal with his boots, and his hands shook so badly that he fumbled with the laces for longer than was comfortable. "Your hands," she said from somewhere behind him. "Let me." Before he could object or agree, she was crouching beside him with brisk efficiency and working the frozen laces open with fingers that, he noticed, moved with practiced ease. She got both boots off and set them near the stove to dry, then straightened. "Sit," she said, nodding at the nearer chair. He sat. His body did not argue. She went to the stove, took down a tin mug from the shelf above it, and poured coffee. She brought it to him without asking if he wanted it, which was correct, because any man who just rode 3 days through a blizzard and did not want coffee when offered it was a man past helping. She set it in his hands and her fingers briefly overlapped his, and even through the beginning return of feeling in his skin, he registered the warmth of her touch as distinct from the warmth of the mug. He drank. The coffee was extraordinary. It was hot and dark, and had a slight bitterness at the back of it that was exactly right, and it spread through him like the first true warmth he had felt in days. "Thank you," he said, and his voice came out rougher than he intended. "Caroline Reed," she said, pulling the second chair out from the table and sitting across from him, folding her hands together on the table in front of her with the manner of someone prepared to conduct a civil conversation. "This is my homestead, my father's claim before that. He passed in September." "I'm sorry," Micah said, and he meant it. "Micah Wallace," he said, because she had given him her name and it was the appropriate return. I'm nothing in particular at the moment. Lately, a cattle hand, recently defrauded, currently lost. Something that might have been the beginning of a smile moved at the corner of her mouth. That's an honest accounting. I try, he said. He looked around the cabin more carefully now that warmth and coffee were slowly restoring his capacity for observation. It was her space in every detail, not in a decorative way but in the deeper way of a place where someone has thought carefully about how to live. There were 2 rifle hooks beside the door with both hooks occupied. There were preserves on the shelf in careful labeled rows. There was a spinning wheel in the corner that showed use. There were books, 4 of them stacked together, which in the Wyoming territory in 1878 was no small thing. Your father homesteaded this, he asked. Filed the claim in 1871, she said. Moved out here from Missouri in the spring of 1872. I came with him. My mother had passed the year before. She said it the way people say things that happened a long time ago and have been fully lived with, not without feeling but without the rawness of fresh wounds. He built the cabin and the barn. I helped where I could. It's well built, Micah said, because it was. He was a careful man, she said. There was something in the way she said careful, with a kind of quiet reverence, that told him the word carried more than its surface meaning for her. Outside, the wind came at the cabin in a long, sustained push that made the walls creak once and then went silent. Neither of them spoke for a moment. The stove ticked. Somewhere outside, further than the barn but not impossibly far, something that was probably a tree branch gave way with a crack that was sharp even through the walls. You won't be going anywhere tonight, Caroline said, which was not a question. Or likely tomorrow. No, Micah agreed. I wouldn't ask your hospitality past what you're willing to give, but I don't think my horse and I would make it back to any kind of shelter before dark. There's a supply of hay in the barn that's more than my animals need for the winter, she said. Your horse can stay there. You can sleep on the floor in here if you're willing to make do with an extra blanket. I have a spare. That's more than generous, Micah said. I can pay you for the trouble. You can earn it, she said, and it was not unfriendly, just practical. There's wood that needs splitting. The fence on the north side of the property lost 2 rails in the last storm. I haven't had the time to fix it. And if you know anything about stove repair, the damper on this one has been sticking since October. I know about stoves, he said. Then we have an arrangement, she said, and stood and went back to whatever she had been doing at the workbench before he knocked, which appeared to involve mending a leather harness with what he could see was careful and competent stitchwork. Micah held his coffee with both hands and thought that, in the full catalog of places he had ended up unexpectedly in 15 years of working the western frontier, this was by some distance the most unlikely, and by a considerable margin the one he felt most quietly, inexplicably relieved to be in. He slept on the floor that night with a wool blanket that smelled faintly of cedar, and he slept better than he had in months. Morning came gray and white, and the blizzard had not let up. If anything, it had deepened overnight, and when Micah looked out the single south-facing window of the cabin, all he could see was white in every direction, a landscape that had been stripped of all detail and replaced with pure, undifferentiated cold. Caroline was already awake. This he discovered when he opened his eyes to find the fire in the stove already rebuilt and the coffee pot already on, and Caroline herself sitting at the table with one of her 4 books open before her, reading in the early gray light with the focused attention of someone for whom this was a regular and valued practice. She had her hair down still, the dark waves of it loose around her shoulders, and she had not heard him wake or was choosing to give him the courtesy of pretending she had not. And either way, there was something about the sight of her there, entirely at home in her own life, reading her book in the pale winter light with the smell of coffee rising through the small, warm space that went straight into Micah's chest and sat there like an ember. He sat up carefully so as not to startle her. She looked up from her book. "Coffee's nearly ready," she said, and looked back at her page. He folded his blanket neatly and stacked it on the end of the bed alcove because putting it back on her bed unasked seemed too familiar, and leaving it in the middle of the floor seemed ungrateful. He ran a hand over his jaw, which had about a week of growth on it at this point, and made a mental note to ask if she had a razor he might borrow. "I'll go check on the animals," he said, pulling on his now dry boots. "The bay mare is named Dora," Caroline said without looking up from her book. "She's particular about strangers. Move slowly with her. The cow is Henrietta. She'll have already told you that she needs milking by the time you get there." The barn was cold, but not dangerously so, and when Micah opened the door, Calder nickered a greeting that had some of yesterday's exhaustion still in it, but was considerably more alive than the horse had been when Micah brought him in. The bay mare, Dora, watched him from her stall with large dark eyes that contained, he thought, a genuine skepticism, and he moved with deliberate slowness as he checked her water and threw down more hay. The cow was exactly as advertised, regarding him with an expression of profound impatience and the full utter restlessness of an animal who has strong opinions about schedules. He found the milk pail hanging on a nail near the stall and milked Henrietta with the ease of a man who had grown up doing it, which he had. He carried the milk back to the cabin through the driving snow, which hit his face like small cold needles and reduced his visibility to about 15 feet, and set the pail on the workbench when he came back inside. Caroline looked up from her now-closed book, from which he understood she had finished it or set it aside, and saw the milk pail. "You know how to milk a cow," she said. "Grew up on a farm in Kansas," he said, "before I came west." Something in her expression shifted slightly, not toward warmth exactly, but toward something like interest, a recalibration of her assessment of him. She poured him coffee without being asked and set it on the table, and this time she poured one for herself as well and sat across from him, and there was a different quality to the silence between them than there had been the evening before. Less cautious, more thoughtful. "Kansas," she said. "What part?" "Near Abilene," he said, "before it became what it became." He wrapped his hands around the mug and thought back to a place that felt like it belonged to a different life. "My family had a wheat farm. Not a large one. My father sold it in 1863 and we moved to Lawrence the year before the raid." Caroline was quiet for a moment. "Quantrill's raid," she said. "Yes," he said. He did not elaborate. Some things did not need elaboration. "I'm sorry," she said, and she meant it in the same way he had meant it the night before when he said it about her father, simply and without decoration. "It was a long time ago," he said. "I was 14. She looked at him across the table with a steadiness that was not pitying but was something more useful, a clear recognition of the reality of a thing without needing to flinch away from it or dress it up. He found he appreciated that more than he would have expected to. "What brought you to Wyoming?" she asked. "Same thing that brought most people," he said. "The idea that there was enough land and enough sky that a man could build something that was truly his." He turned the mug in his hands. "The law doesn't always agree with the idea." "No," she said. "It doesn't." He looked at her. "You've had trouble with the law or the lack of it." "After my father died," she said, "a man from Harlow Creek came out 3 times in the month of October to suggest that a woman alone on a homestead this size was impractical, and that I would be better served selling the claim and going back east." She said it with a flatness that was not the flatness of someone who didn't feel things, but of someone who had decided feeling this particular thing in front of a stranger was not something she was going to do. "He represents a land acquisition company out of Denver. They've been picking up abandoned and disputed claims throughout this valley for the past 2 years. "Did he threaten you?" Micah asked, and the question came out with a directness that was not entirely impersonal. "He was very polite about it," she said, "which was in some ways worse. His name, Harlan Cross," she said. "He'll come back in the spring when the snow clears enough to ride out here. He came the last time with another man, and I met them both at the door with my father's Sharps rifle, and we had a civil conversation from that distance." Micah thought about this for a moment. "Is the Sharps in working order?" "Perfectly," she said. "I maintain it myself." Of course she did. He drank his coffee and felt something in him that was not quite protectiveness and not quite admiration, but was some third thing that sat between them, warm and unannounced, like the heat from the stove. The snow kept up for 2 full days more, which meant that Micah and Caroline existed together in the close quarters of the cabin in a way that required the development of a mutual understanding, unspoken but clear, about the rhythms of shared space. She read in the mornings. He carved, having found a short piece of pine in the wood pile that his hands apparently felt required a knife's attention, and he turned it into a serviceable ladle over 2 evenings in a way that kept his hands occupied while they talked. And they talked. Slowly at first, with the care of 2 people who had both become accustomed to their own company and needed to remember how conversation worked between people who had no particular stake in impressing one another. She told him about Missouri, about a childhood that had been shaped by the particular violence of a state that had torn itself apart over the question of slavery in the years before the formal war began, and about a father who had believed with deep conviction that a man's first obligation was to see clearly and act honestly on what he saw. She said this last part looking out the window at the snow as though she were looking at her father's face, and Micah thought about all the ways a person could carry someone they loved. He told her about the cattle trade, about the years after the war when he had come west at 17 with almost nothing, and worked for 5 years as a ranch hand before he and Dale Prute had put together their own operation. He told her about the land, the particular satisfaction of knowing a piece of ground well enough to read its moods, to know where the water ran and where the grass came back first in spring, and where a calf was likely to go if it got separated from its mother. He told her about losing all of it in the courthouse, and when he did, he was surprised to find that saying it out loud in this particular room to this particular woman took some of its weight away, the way lancing a wound hurts in the moment but makes the healing possible. She listened to all of it without offering false comfort, which he appreciated. She asked questions that showed she had been paying attention, the specific, detail-oriented questions of someone who processes the world through its particulars rather than its generalities. On the evening of the second full day of being snowed in, she made a stew from dried beans and salt pork, and the last of a bunch of carrots she had stored in the cold cellar beneath the cabin floor, and it was one of the best things Micah had eaten in recent memory, which he said, and she received the compliment with the slightly surprised look of a person not entirely accustomed to being thanked for things she considered merely practical. "My mother was a good cook," she said. "She taught me everything she knew before she died. I was 19. How old are you now?" He asked because the question had been sitting at the edge of his awareness since the first night and it seemed like the right time. 26, she said. "You?" 31, he said. She nodded as though she had already estimated approximately this and was confirming rather than learning. After supper, they sat near the stove because the far end of the cabin had developed a drafty cold that the fire could not quite reach, and Caroline took up her mending and Micah worked on the ladle, and they were quiet together in a way that had by now lost any awkwardness and become something he recognized with some surprise as comfortable. Genuinely comfortable, not the false ease of people performing ease but the real thing, the kind that came from having said enough true things to one another that pretense was no longer worth the effort. "Have you thought about what you'll do?" she asked, not looking up from the harness. "In the spring?" "Some," he said. He ran his thumb along the bowl of the ladle, testing the curve. "There's a man in Harlow Creek who runs a livery stable. We met once at a cattle auction in Cheyenne. He mentioned he was looking for a part-hand, part-manager type to run the operation. He's getting older and his sons went to California." "Josiah Hale," Caroline said. Micah looked at her. "You know him." "Everyone in the valley knows Josiah," she said, and there was clear affection in her voice. "He brings supplies out to the homesteads in his wagon every month or so, things people can't always get to town for. He brought me flour and lamp oil after my father died." She paused her stitching briefly. "He's a good man, one of the good ones." Micah turned this over in his mind. The idea of Harlow Creek was no longer purely abstract. had become in the last 2 days a place with a geography of real people, with Josiah Hale who brought supplies and Harlan Cross who wanted land, and presumably the full spectrum of ordinary human life in between. "And you," he said. "You're intending to stay on the claim through the spring." "I'm intending to stay on it permanently," she said, with a firmness that admitted no alternative interpretation. "My father filed this claim legally. I have inherited it legally. A man from Denver and his polite suggestions are not going to change that." The absolute conviction in her voice was something he felt physically, like a shift in the air pressure in the room. "No," he said. "I don't imagine they will." She looked at him then, directly, with those brown-amber eyes that he had been thinking about at various points over the past 2 days in a way he was beginning to admit to himself had nothing to do with practicality. "You said you were a cattleman," she said. "Was," he said. "A man who knows cattle and knows land," she said carefully, "and who is looking for a direction might find that Harlow Creek is a reasonable place to establish himself." She said it looking at him with a steadiness that he thought was deliberate, a choice to say a clear thing and let it be heard. He met her eyes. "It might be," he said. The stove popped. The wind had eased outside for the first time in 2 days to a steady blow rather than a roar. "The snow will ease by day after tomorrow," she said, looking back at her mending. "You can ride into Harlow Creek and speak with Josiah." "I can," he said. "It's 11 miles northeast along the ridge line," she said. "If you follow the ridge rather than dropping into the valley floor, you'll avoid the worst drifts." He worked the ladle for a while in silence, and then he said, "I'd like to stop back here before winter is fully through, if that would be agreeable to you. There's the fence rail you mentioned, and the damper on the stove." Caroline was quiet for a moment. "The damper has been an inconvenience for 2 months," she said finally, which was not exactly yes and was entirely not no. On the third morning the storm had broken into a cold, clear, brilliant blue sky that made the snow-covered landscape look like something out of a painting, every surface throwing back light in a way that made Micah squint even looking out the window. The temperature was brutal, but the wind had gone quiet, which meant it was survivable. After breakfast, which Caroline made with the same quiet competence with which she seemed to do everything, eggs from the 3 chickens she was keeping in a partitioned corner of the barn that he had discovered on his second morning of chores, Micah packed his saddlebags and went to saddle Calder. The horse was rested and well fed and ready, prancing slightly in the stall in a way that suggested he too had decided that 3 days of standing in a warm barn had been pleasant, but it was time to move again. Caroline was standing on the porch when he brought Calder around. She had her coat on and her arms crossed against the cold, and the morning light was hitting her face in a way that made him pause with his foot in the stirrup. "I finished the ladle," he said, and pulled it out of his coat pocket and held it out to her. She took it and turned it over in her hands. He had finished the bowl smooth and carved a small, simple pattern of a sprig of some kind of plant along the handle, not because it was necessary, but because his hands had wanted to. She looked up at him with an expression that he could not entirely read, but which had something in it that was different from anything that had been there in the first minutes when she had opened the door to find a half-frozen stranger on her porch. "Thank you," she said. "It's well made." "So is your homestead," he said. "Your father taught you right." Her throat moved. She looked down at the ladle again briefly and then back up at him. "Ride carefully," she said. "Keep the ridge line. Don't go down into the valley until you can see the smoke from town." "I will," he said. He swung up into the saddle and Calder turned readily toward the northeast, ready for the trail. Micah settled his hat against the cold and looked back once at the cabin, at Caroline standing on the porch with the carved ladle in her hands, and the snow piled 3 feet against the split-rail fence, and the thin line of smoke rising straight up from the stovepipe in the still cold air, and something pulled at him with the kind of gentle insistence that he had learned in 31 years was worth paying attention to. He lifted a hand. She lifted hers. He rode. Harlow Creek was not large. It sat in a valley cut by the creek it was named for, which was currently frozen over in most places, and it had the particular character of frontier settlements that had been established with a specific practical purpose, and had grown slowly and genuinely, rather than being imposed on the landscape by outside speculation. There was a main street with a mercantile, a livery stable, a boarding house that also served as the saloon in the evenings, a small church built in 1875, and a scattering of houses and outbuildings spreading back from the main street toward the tree line. The whole thing had about 230 residents, more if you counted the outlying homesteaders in the valley, and it had the feeling of a place that knew itself. Josiah Hale's livery stable was at the north end of the main street, a large, well-maintained structure that showed its owner's investment. Micah rode up to it in the early afternoon, his face raw from the cold of the 11-mile ride, and a man came out of the office door before Micah had even finished dismounting. Josiah Hale was somewhere in his middle 60s, thick through the chest and shoulders in a way that had been powerful in his youth, and had settled into solid without losing its authority. He had white hair and a mustache and eyes that were sharp and unhurried and missed nothing. "Micah Wallace," he said, with the tone of a man confirming something he had suspected. "I heard you were in the territory. Tom Garrett from Cheyenne told me about the fruit business." His expression said clearly what he thought of the fruit business. "You look like you've been through something." "Worst winter in 20 years, Micah said. 30, Josiah said firmly. "Come inside." They sat in the office, which was heated by a small iron stove and smelled agreeably of horse and leather and machine oil, and Josiah produced a bottle of whiskey from a drawer with the ease of a man who kept whiskey in desk drawers as a matter of sound logistical planning, and they drank a measure each and talked. Josiah's position was straightforward. He was 64 years old, his back gave him trouble that was only going to worsen, and his 2 sons had gone to California in 1875 and shown no signs of returning. He needed someone to run the day-to-day operations of the stable, manage the horses, oversee the wagon service he provided to the outlying homesteads, and eventually, if it came to that, take over the business when Josiah was no longer able to run it himself. He offered fair wages and a room above the stable office. "I know you're a cattleman," Josiah said, "not a stable man, but cattle and horses aren't so different in the ways that matter, and the valley's growing. There's room for a man with your experience here." Micah thought about Caroline Reed's cabin, 11 miles southwest along the ridge line. He thought about Harlan Cross, who would come back in the spring when the snow cleared, with his polite suggestions and his companion and his acquisition company in Denver. "I'll take it," he said. Josiah nodded as though this had been settled some time ago. "Rooms upstairs are clean," he said. "Mrs. Adler at the boarding house serves supper from 6 until 8. The food is reliable." "One other thing," Micah said. "There's a homestead to the southwest, the Reed claim, Caroline Reed. Her father filed it in 1871 and passed in September." Josiah's expression changed slightly. He set down his glass. "She's all right," he said, and the question had genuine concern in it. "She's all right," Micah said. "I sheltered there during the worst of the storm. She's capable and prepared. She has provisions and firewood, and her livestock are sound." He paused. "She mentioned a man named Harlan Cross." Josiah's jaw tightened. "He came through here in October," he said. "Came to the livery to hire a horse and asked me pointed questions about which homesteads in the valley had unclear succession after their holders died. I told him I didn't know of any and wasn't inclined to help him find out." "He'll be back in the spring," Micah said. "He will," Josiah agreed. "And Caroline Reed has as clean a legal claim to that land as anyone in this valley. Her father recorded it properly. I helped him file the paperwork myself." His eyes sharpened on Micah with the unblinking attention of a man who has lived long enough to read situations clearly. "You planning to be in that direction come spring?" "I'm planning to fix a fence rail and a stove damper," Micah said evenly. Josiah picked up his glass and turned it in his hands, and the corner of his mouth moved. "That's a specific list for a man who just arrived in town." "I made a promise," Micah said. Josiah was quiet for a moment and then he said, "She's a good woman. Best kind of good, not the kind that requires an audience." He looked at Micah steadily. "Her father Thomas was one of the finest men I've known in 40 years on this frontier. A man who earned that kind of opinion from Thomas Reed's daughter would have to be worth something." Micah did not say anything to this, because there was nothing to say to it that would not reveal more than he was ready to reveal, even to himself. He moved into the room above the stable office that evening. The weeks that followed had their own rhythm. Micah learned the stable's operations quickly, because Josiah was a good teacher, and because Micah had the foundation of 15 years working with animals and the particular attentiveness of a man who genuinely respected what he was working with. The winter held its grip on the valley, releasing only briefly into above-freezing temperatures before tightening again. But the worst of the blizzards had passed, and men were moving through the settlement again, and the livery was busy. He thought about Caroline more than he intended to. This was not a new experience in the sense that he had thought about women before, but it was new in its particular texture. He thought about specific things. The way she talked about her father, the way she had passed him the coffee without asking, the way the morning light had come through the window and hit the side of her face while she was reading, the absolute unflinching steadiness of her when she said she was staying on that claim permanently. He thought about the carved ladle in her hands and the way she had looked at it. He wrote her a letter. This was not a simple decision. He sat at the small desk in his room above the stable office for the better part of an evening composing it, and what he arrived at was not particularly eloquent but was honest, which he judged to be the more important quality. He told her he had taken the position with Josiah Hale, that the room was clean and the food at the boarding house was reliable, that Calder was in good health and had apparently made a favorable impression on the other horses in the stable. He told her he had spoken to Josiah about Harlan Cross, and that Josiah intended to consult with the Territorial Land Office in Cheyenne in the early spring regarding the formal documentation of her inheritance of the claim. He told her he intended to come out in the first week of February if the weather permitted to fix the fence rail and the stove damper, as promised. He ended it. "I find I have thought more about that cup of coffee than any cup of coffee has any right to demand. I hope you are well and that Henrietta is managing her schedule to everyone's satisfaction." He folded it and addressed it to Caroline Reed, Reed Homestead, Harlow Creek Valley, Wyoming Territory, and gave it to Josiah, who was the most reliable postal conduit between the stable and the outlying homesteads. 3 weeks later a letter came back. It was written in a clear, firm hand, and it was considerably shorter than his had been, but he read it 3 times. She said the claim paperwork was in a lockbox under her father's bed, and had been since 1871. She knew exactly where it was, and would make a copy to send to Josiah at his earliest convenience. She said the fence had lost a third rail in another wind storm the week before, and the situation was becoming unreasonable. She said Henrietta had strong opinions about everything, and had communicated her approval of the carved ladle by bumping it with her nose when Caroline left it on the workbench. She said she would expect him on whatever morning in early February that the weather made reasonable, and that she would have coffee on. She signed it, Caroline Reed. He read the part about having coffee on 4 more times, and then folded the letter and put it in the inside pocket of his coat where it stayed for the following 2 weeks. He rode out on the 7th of February, which was cold but clear and still, the kind of winter day that was not kind exactly but was honest about what it was and let you move through it if you were adequately dressed. He brought lumber for the fence rails from Josiah's supply, loaded on a pack horse he borrowed from the stable, and a new damper plate for the stove that he had ordered from the mercantile, and he brought flour and coffee from Josiah's supply run as a contribution to the provisions of a household he was about to inconvenience for the day. He could smell the coffee when he was still 10 yards from the porch. She opened the door before he knocked. She had apparently heard Calder's hooves on the frozen ground, or had been watching from the window, and she was standing in the doorway with her arms crossed against the cold, but her expression was open in a way that was different from the first time he had stood on this porch, and that difference registered in him as something significant. "You're on time," she said. "You have coffee on," he said. "I said I would," she said, and stepped back to let him in. He hitched the horses to the porch rail, rather than putting them in the barn immediately, because he wanted to get inside the temperature question of the stove before he did anything else. He had been right about the damper. The mechanism had rusted partly open, which meant the stove was burning through wood faster than it needed to and not holding heat as efficiently as it should have been. He had the new plate fitted and the damper moving properly in about 45 minutes, which required lying on the floor beside the stove at one point and reaching up into the apparatus at an uncomfortable angle, and when he emerged with soot on his face and hands, she was waiting with a damp cloth and an expression that was trying not to be amused and not entirely succeeding. "Thank you," he said, accepting the cloth. "How long has it been working properly?" she asked. "Just now," he said. "So I've been burning twice the wood I needed to since October," she said, with a sigh that was more exasperated than distressed. "You have a good supply laid in," he said. "I laid in double what I estimated I would need," she said, and he thought that was entirely characteristic of her, and that the double supply was what had let her be comfortable and prepared through a winter that would have destroyed a less careful person's planning. He went out and put the horses in the barn while she made dinner, and then they ate together at the small table with the ease of people doing a familiar thing for the second time, and he noticed as they ate that the ladle he had carved was in the pot she had used to stir the soup. After eating, they worked on the fence together, which was not a one-person job in any reasonable sense. The posts were solid but needed the mortises cleaned out before the new rails could be seated, and Caroline worked beside him without being directed, reading the job intuitively, and doing the parts of it that needed doing without commentary or direction. And they worked well together in the cold, bright afternoon light, with the fence taking shape rail by rail, until all three missing sections were back in place, and the north line of the property was sound again. They stood back and looked at it. Their breath rose in white puffs in the cold air, and there was snow on the shoulders of both of them from where they had been kneeling in the drifts. "Better," she said. "Much better," he agreed. She looked at him sideways from under the brim of her hat and then looked back at the fence. "You do good work," she said. "You've known what you were doing all day without having to be told." "You work the same way," he said. "It's easy to work with someone who doesn't need managing." She turned to look at him properly then, with a directness that was entirely characteristic of everything he had come to understand about her. "Micah," she said, and it was the first time she had used his first name, which he realized was itself something. "What are you doing here?" He understood she was not asking about the fence or the stove damper. The afternoon light was long and amber, and it fell across her face and turned her brown eyes toward gold, and he looked at her and thought about the 31 years that had taken him from a wheat farm in Kansas through a raid and a war and 15 years of building and losing and moving and ending up, against all reasonable expectation, on the frozen front range of the Wyoming territory, with a woman who made coffee that tasted like something worth riding 3 days through a blizzard for. "I'm not entirely sure," he said, which was honest, "but I think I'm doing the thing I should be doing." She was quiet for a long moment, looking at him with that steady amber gaze. The cold had put color in her cheeks, and there was a strand of dark hair across her face from the wind that she had not bothered to push back. "Come in for coffee," she said finally, "before we freeze." He followed her inside. They had coffee. They talked until the light outside went from amber to gray to the particular deep blue of a clear winter evening, and the conversation moved through more territory than he could easily account for later, through the particulars of the valley and the homesteads and what Josiah knew about the land acquisition company, and what Caroline thought about the direction the territory was likely to take in the next 10 years, and through things less practical, books she had read, and what she thought of them. The way the stars looked at this altitude on clear nights, a memory she had of her father teaching her to read by lamplight when she was 5 years old. At one point, she was making a point about the territorial land registry system, gesturing with one hand while the other held her coffee cup, and her hand brushed his on the table where it was resting, and neither of them moved away from the contact, and the conversation continued, but the contact stayed, his hand turning slightly so that the warmth of her fingers rested against his knuckles, a small and unremarkable thing that was not unremarkable at all. When he finally rose to go, because the evening was fully dark and he needed to get back to the ridge line before the temperature dropped further, she walked him to the door and he stopped with his hat in his hands, and she was standing close enough that he was very aware of her. "I'll come back in 2 weeks," he said. "Josiah is planning his supply run and I'm managing the wagon. I'll route it this direction." "That would be useful," she said. "I'm running low on salt and lamp oil." "I know," he said. "I packed extra on the order." Something moved across her face that was warm and complicated, and she looked down briefly before looking back up at him. "Thank you," she said. "For the fence and the stove. Thank you for the coffee," he said, "and for not letting me freeze to death in February." "You weren't going to freeze to death in February," she said. "You were in the barn with 3 other animals and enough hay." "I was closer to it than you might think when I rode up in December," he said. She studied his face for a moment. "I know," she said more quietly. "I could see it." He put his hat on. "Good night, Caroline." "Good night, Micah," she said. He rode back to Harlow Creek through the cold dark with the stars enormous and brilliant overhead, and he was warm all the way through despite the temperature, in a way that had nothing to do with the heat of the cabin he had left behind. The supply runs became the structure of the late winter and early spring, Micah managing Josiah's wagon through the valley every 2 weeks, and the Reed homestead was always the last stop on the route, which meant he always arrived there in the late afternoon and always stayed to help with whatever wanted doing, and always stayed for supper. And those evenings at the small table in Caroline's cabin became something he organized the rest of his time around in a way he tried not to examine too carefully, because examination might require him to name it, and naming it felt like something with consequences. But the evenings were not enough to contain what was growing between them. It grew in the practical things, in the easy way they worked alongside each other, in the conversations that started about the weather and the livestock and the state of the territorial law, and ended up somewhere else entirely, in the way she had started calling him by his name in the easy, unconscious way of people who have become real to each other. It grew in the moments he caught her watching him, and the moments he knew she caught him watching her, and neither of them looked away, just held the look until the air between them was too full of something, and one of them found a reason to speak. In March, on a supply run morning when the snow was finally beginning to thin in the exposed places, and the creek was sending up a sound of moving water from beneath its ice crust, he stopped the wagon at the edge of her property, and she was already outside, which was not unusual. She was nearly always outside when he arrived, doing some part of the endless work of a one-person homestead, and this morning she was carrying a bucket from the barn, and she stopped when she heard the wagon and looked at him. And the morning light hit her the way it had on that first morning he had woken up in her cabin, and the thing in his chest that had been growing since December became too big to be comfortable any longer. He set the wagon brake and climbed down. "I need to say something to you," he said. She set the bucket down on the porch rail. She looked at him with her arms at her sides and her face calm and open. "All right," she said. "I'm not a man with a great deal to offer right now," he said. "I have a job and a room and a horse and the beginning of a good reputation with Josiah, which might eventually mean something. I lost the land and the cattle and I'm starting from the ground again at 31, which is not nothing, but it's not what I would have wanted to be bringing to this conversation." She did not speak. She watched him. "But I am a man who knows what he's found when he finds it," he said. "And I have found, which I did not expect and did not plan for, that you are the most remarkable woman I have ever met, Caroline, and I am asking, without any promise of immediate comfort or certainty, if there is anything here between us that you would be willing to let become more than it is." The silence after he finished was about 4 seconds long and felt considerably longer. "Micah Wallace," she said, "you have been the thing I look forward to the most since the second time you rode onto this property, and I am not a woman who looks forward to things lightly." She picked up the bucket again with one hand and held the other out to him. "Come in and have coffee and stop being dramatic about it." He took her hand and held it, and the grip of her fingers around his was warm and certain. He followed her inside. Spring came to the Wyoming territory the way it usually did, in fits and starts, with cold rain following warm sun following frost following mud in a sequence that required agricultural patience. The valley went from white to brown to the first hesitant green in the low places near the creek, and the snow went back up the mountains to its summer positions on the highest peaks, and the roads opened, and the world started moving again after its winter compression. And in the first week of April, Harlan Cross came back. Micah was at the stable when Josiah came in from the street with his jaw set, and his eyes flat with something that in a younger man would have been anger, and in Josiah Hale was the considerably more effective quantity of quiet determination. "Cross is at the boarding house," Josiah said. "He has a man with him, a fellow named Terrence Webb, who is apparently some kind of land law specialist from Denver. They've been asking around town about homestead records." Micah put down the harness he was repairing. "When are they riding out to the Reed claim?" "Tomorrow morning, I think," Josiah said, "unless something gives them reason to reconsider." He looked at Micah with the focused attention of a man delivering a message in a particular way. "I received the response from the Cheyenne Land Office last week. I was going to tell you next time I saw you." "Tell me now," Micah said. The response from the Cheyenne Land Office was better than either of them had hoped. Thomas Reed's original claim filing was clean. The transfer paperwork that Josiah had filed on Caroline's behalf documenting her inheritance of the claim had been processed and confirmed. And there was a letter from the Territorial Registrar's office confirming Caroline Victoria Reed as the sole legal holder of the Reed homestead claim, recorded and official. The acquisition company's interest in the property had no legal basis whatsoever. Micah rode to the Reed homestead that afternoon rather than waiting for the next supply run, pushing Calder at a pace that was more urgent than he usually asked of the horse on that ridgeline trail. When he arrived, Caroline was in the kitchen garden that she had started clearing for spring planting, and she came to meet him when she heard the hooves, wiping her hands on her work apron. She read his face before he spoke. "What happened?" she said. He told her. All of it, the paperwork from Cheyenne, Cross at the boarding house, the likely visit in the morning. She listened without interruption, with the same steady attention she brought to everything. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment, and then she let out a breath that had something in it of the weight she had been carrying since October. "So the claim is legal and documented and confirmed," she said. "As legal as anything in this territory," Micah said. "Josiah has the letter in his office. You should have a copy here." "I'll ride in tomorrow morning before Cross can ride out," she said. "I'll have the document in my hand when he arrives. He can take his suggestions back to Denver." "I'd like to come with you," Micah said. "Not as a guardian, not as a protector. As the person who wanted to be beside her for the things she had been carrying alone through a long winter." She looked at him for a moment, and the late afternoon light was doing everything to her face that light had been doing to her face every time he looked at her since December. "All right," she said. "Come in for supper." They rode into Harlow Creek the next morning together, side by side on the broad trail, the spring air carrying the smell of mud and green things and the creek running full and cold from the snowmelt. Josiah met them at the livery with the letter in hand, and Caroline read it in the stable office with Josiah and Micah watching her, and when she looked up her eyes were bright in a way that was not quite tears and was more than relief. "My father filed this in 1871, she said. "He did," Josiah said. I watched him do it. He paid the filing fee in silver coin and kept the receipt in that lockbox of his. Cross and his companion Webb arrived at the livery not 2 hours later, apparently having inquired around town and been directed to Josiah as the man most likely to have information about the Reed claim. They were both well-dressed for the frontier in a way that spoke of Denver money and not Wyoming experience, and Cross had the easy confidence of a man accustomed to conversations going the direction he pointed them. That confidence encountered Caroline Reed and did not survive the meeting intact. She gave him the territorial registrar's letter, which she had now had a chance to read in full, and had clearly committed to memory in the particular way she committed things she cared about. She was polite and absolutely immovable, and she said, in the direct, low voice that Micah had come to understand, was the voice she used when she was most serious, that the Reed claim was registered, legal and unambiguous, that she had lived and worked on it for 6 years, that her father had built every post and rail and wall of it with his own hands, and that she was not going anywhere. Cross looked at her and then at Micah, who was standing a few feet behind Caroline's left shoulder in the purely geographic sense of a man who happened to be there, and then at Josiah, and he appeared to perform some internal calculation about the ratio of effort to outcome. We were simply trying to ensure a smooth transition of any unclaimed properties, Webb said in the careful language of legal men. The property is claimed, Caroline said, legally and continuously. You have the documentation. Cross looked at her for another moment, and whatever he was looking for or hoping to find was not there, and he nodded once, a precise nod that conceded the point without granting anything extra. They left on the afternoon stage back toward Cheyenne, and Josiah watched them go from the doorway of the livery and then turned to Micah with an expression of satisfaction that he wore without any effort to conceal it. "Well," he said. "Well," Micah agreed. Caroline was standing in the middle of the street watching the stage diminish along the valley road, and Micah came to stand beside her, and without looking at him she reached over and took his hand, and they stood there together watching the dust settle in the spring air. "It's done," she said. "It's done," he said. She turned and looked at him, and her eyes were clear and warm, and the spring light was doing what light did, and he thought he had been watching that face for 4 months now, and he was nowhere near finished watching it. "I want to ask you something," he said. "I've noticed you build toward things," she said, with the small near smile that he had learned was one of her rarer genuine expressions. "Go ahead." "I want to marry you," he said, not a question precisely, or not only a question, more of a statement of a fact he had arrived at and was now putting on the table between them to be examined in the full light. She looked at him for a long moment. "Josiah," she called without taking her eyes off Micah. "Yes," said Josiah from the livery doorway. "Is there a justice of the peace in this county?" "Judge Morley over in Elkins Fork," Josiah said, and there was no concealing the quality of his voice. 20 miles east. He rides the circuit. He'll be in Harlow Creek on the 15th. "That's 2 weeks," Caroline said, still looking at Micah. "I'm aware," he said. 2 weeks is sufficient time to make reasonable arrangements," she said. "Is that a yes?" he said. "It has been a yes," she said, "for some time. I was waiting for you to get around to saying the actual words." He took a breath that went all the way through him. "I should have said them sooner," he said. "You were thorough," she said. "I appreciated the thoroughness." Behind them, Josiah made a sound that was dignified and warm and probably the closest thing to a sob that a man of his particular character was going to permit himself in the middle of a public street, and then apparently retreated into his stable to give them privacy, which was its own kind of gift. They were married on the 15th of April, 1879, in the small church on Harlow Creek's Main Street, with Josiah Hale as witness and Mrs. Adler from the boarding house, who had turned out to have strong feelings about flowers, contributing a spring arrangement that came from the first blooms from her kitchen garden. There were perhaps 30 people in attendance because word had traveled through the valley the way words did in small communities, with enthusiasm and generosity, and most of the outlying homesteaders made the ride in because a wedding in April was the kind of thing the territory needed after the winter it had had. Caroline wore a dress of dark green wool that she had taken apart and remade in the 2 weeks between the proposal and the wedding, the careful, thorough attention to a thing that needed doing right being as characteristic of her approach to marriage preparation as it was to fence mending and stove repair. She wore her hair up with 2 pins that had belonged to her mother, which Micah learned about after the ceremony when she told him quietly, and with the simplicity of someone sharing something that does not require a lot of words. He thought she was the most beautiful thing he had ever looked at, and he told her so, which made her look at him for a moment with an expression that was unguarded in a way that her face was not always unguarded, and she said, quietly, "You're not so bad yourself, Micah Wallace." He laughed, which was not what either of them had expected, and she laughed with him, right there in front of the church in the April light with the valley going green around them and the creek running high and clear behind them, and it was the best sound he had ever heard. They had the question of where to live, which they had discussed practically and at length in the 2 weeks before the wedding. Micah's room above the livery stable was not a home in any real sense, and the Reed homestead was already a home of considerable completeness. The answer was obvious. Micah spoke to Josiah, who had already been thinking about this and had a solution of his own. What Josiah proposed was that Micah continue managing the stable and the supply wagon operations during the week, returning to the homestead on Fridays to spend the weekends. And in the spring, when the workload at the stable permitted longer absences, Micah could work on expanding the cabin and building up the livestock end of the Reed land, which had good grazing and ample water, and had been used only for dairy and small stock since Thomas Reed had not had the capital to buy cattle. "I know a man in Cheyenne who is looking to sell a starter herd at a fair price," Josiah said. "Small operation, 20 head. It would give you something to build from." "I don't have that kind of capital yet," Micah said. "I know," Josiah said. "I do." He raised a hand before Micah could speak. "It's a business arrangement. You'll buy me out over 5 years at no interest. Thomas Reed was my friend for 17 years, and I watched his daughter grow up through his letters and become the woman she is, and this is not charity. It is a sound investment in the direction this valley is going to grow." He paused. "Don't argue with me. I'm 64 years old, and I've earned the right to make decisions without extensive debate." Micah was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Yes, sir." Josiah nodded. "Good. We'll ride to Cheyenne in May." Micah told Caroline that evening, riding out to the homestead in the late afternoon of the day after the wedding. She was at the kitchen garden, and she straightened and listened to the whole thing with her hand shading her eyes against the sun. When he finished, she was quiet. "Cattle," she said. "Small to start," he said. 20 head. We build from there." She looked at the long sweep of the grazing land behind the cabin, the south-facing slope that caught full sun and came up thick and green each spring. "Her father's land, her land, their land. My father wanted cattle," she said quietly. "He never had quite enough saved to do it properly." "I know," Micah said. "Josiah told me." She looked at him, and there was something in her face that was too deep for simple happiness, something layered and complex and entirely genuine. "Micah," she said. "I know," he said again, more gently. She came and stood beside him, and he put his arm around her shoulders, and they looked at the land together, and the evening light came long and golden off the mountains to the west and turned the new grass into something extraordinary, and neither of them spoke for a while, and neither of them needed to. The summer of 1879 was good. The kind of summer the Wyoming Territory offered in its generous seasons that made a person understand why anyone would endure the winters for the right to live there. Long warm days and cool nights, and the creeks full of snowmelt and the grass thick in the valley, and the mountains standing enormous and blue on every horizon. Micah worked at the stable through the week and came home on Fridays, and on the weekends they worked the homestead together, and something in the rhythm of it was as naturally right as anything he had ever known. He built an addition to the cabin over the course of the summer, a proper bedroom off the east wall because the sleep alcove that had been sufficient for a single occupant was not going to manage two for long. He was not a trained carpenter, but he had enough practical building knowledge from his years on the frontier and enough patience to do things twice when he did them wrong the first time. And the addition went up sound and true through June and July and was finished by August. Caroline inspected it with the thoroughness she brought to everything, and her verdict was that it was solid and well made, and the window placement was good for the morning light, which he knew she valued. She told him in August that she was expecting a child. He was in the barn when she told him, forking hay, and he stopped with the fork in both hands and looked at her standing in the barn doorway with the summer evening light behind her, and the feeling that went through him was large and specific and almost too much to hold inside a barn. "When?" he said. "February, I think," she said. "Mrs. Haggerty out on the East Claim has experience with these things. She confirmed my thinking last week." "February," he said. "It might be cold," she said, with the slightly dry quality she brought to statements of the obvious. He set the fork against the stall wall and crossed the barn and took her face in his hands with the careful reverence of a man handling something of incomparable value, and he looked at her and she looked back at him and her eyes were bright. "Are you frightened?" he said very quietly. "Some," she said, which was her version of considerable. "Are you?" "Some," he said, which was also his version of considerable. She pressed her hands over his where they cupped her face. "We'll manage it the way we manage everything," she said. "Together," he said. "Together," she said. He kissed her, there in the warm barn with Calder and Dora watching from their stalls with their characteristic mild interest and Henrietta expressing no opinion, which from Henrietta was essentially an endorsement. He moved out to the homestead full-time that fall. He and Josiah had a long conversation about it, and what they arrived at was that Micah would continue to manage the supply wagon operations and ride into Harlow Creek 3 days a week during the winter and 2 days a week the rest of the time. And Josiah hired a young man named Edgar Bliss from the settlement to help with the daily stable work. Edgar was 17, hardworking, and transparently delighted to be taken seriously at a job. And within 2 months, Josiah had taken him under the older man's wing in a way that seemed to suit both of them and had already begun to address the question of what happened to the stable when Josiah could not run it anymore. The 20 head of cattle were on the Reed land by September, and Micah spent considerable time in those fall months learning the South pasture the way he had learned every piece of land he had ever worked, walking it and mapping it in his memory and understanding where the water ran, and where the grass would hold through the cold, and where a calf in trouble was likely to end up. It was the beginning of something he could feel in the same way he had felt the beginning of things before, the starting momentum of a real operation, small and careful and capable of growing. The winter of 1879 coming on 1880 was not as severe as the winter that had brought Micah to the Reed homestead a year before, but it was not gentle. The snow came in November and settled in for the long duration, and Caroline moved through the later stages of her pregnancy with the practicality she brought to every physical challenge, which was to say she adapted and continued, and did not make a great deal of fuss while Micah made, he suspected, considerably more fuss internally than she found proportionate. Mrs. Haggerty from the East Claim came out in the 2nd week of February, and so did Josiah's wife Ellen, who it turned out had her own experience in these matters and had been waiting to be asked with a patience that said a great deal about her character. The birth was long, and there were several hours in the middle of it when Micah sat on the porch in the cold February night and stared at the same stars he had looked at the night he rode back from that first day of fence repair and stove damper work, and he talked quietly to them about the deal he was willing to make with the universe regarding the people inside the cabin, and hoped the universe was listening. His son was born in the deep, cold, early morning of the 14th of February, which was a date that struck everyone who heard it as either improbably romantic or simply impractical, depending on their nature. He was a solid, healthy, loud-voiced boy who Caroline held against her chest with an expression on her face that Micah had never seen there before, and filed immediately in the part of his memory reserved for things he intended to keep forever. They named him Thomas, for Caroline's father. "He would have liked you," Caroline said, the following morning when the visitors had gone and the cabin was quiet, and she was in bed with Thomas asleep in the cradle Micah had built in November, and Micah was sitting on the edge of the bed watching them both with an incapacity for doing anything practical that he had resigned himself to. "I think I would have liked him too," Micah said. "Any man who built this place and raised a woman like you knew what mattered." She looked at him over the top of Thomas's sleeping head. "That might be the nicest thing you've ever said to me." "I'll try to do better," he said. "You're doing fine," she said. Thomas Wallace grew through the spring of 1880 and into the summer, which was a good summer, and through it all the homestead grew around him. The cattle herd went from 20 to 35 by summer's end, supplemented by a bull Micah bought at the Cheyenne stock sale in June, with the first small profits from the previous autumn sales. The cabin addition proved to have been the right size for the current family, and would need another addition by the time Thomas had a sibling, which was a thought Micah held at the back of his mind with a quiet and particular pleasure. Josiah came out to the homestead on a Sunday in August with Ellen, which they had begun doing monthly, and they sat on the porch in the warm evening with coffee and watched Thomas, who was 6 months old and had developed strong opinions about everything he could reach, and Josiah told Micah that he was intending to formally sell him the management of the supply wagon operations with an option to purchase the stable in full within 3 years. "Edgar can run the stable day to day," Josiah said. "He's ready. I'm not ready to stop entirely, but I'm ready to stop being responsible for every nail." He looked at Micah over his coffee. "This valley is going to need someone who knows both the land and the town side of things as it grows. I think that person is you." Micah thought about a December morning in a blizzard, riding toward a thin line of smoke because there was nowhere else to go. He thought about a woman opening a door and looking at him with cautious brown eyes and stepping back to let him in without ceremony or fuss because the situation required it, and she was a person who did what the situation required. "I'll take the arrangement," he said. "Good," Josiah said, and drank his coffee. Ellen reached over and took Josiah's hand on the arm of his chair, and they sat together in the August evening light, the way people sit together when they have been in the same place for a long time and know each other past the point where words are required for everything. And Micah looked at them, and then at Caroline, who was holding Thomas and looking out at the grazing land where the cattle moved in the evening, the south-facing slope that had always been good for it. And she turned and found him looking, and her expression was the open, unguarded one that he had been the particular recipient of for almost 2 years now, and that still hit him somewhere deep every time. He reached over and took her hand. The Wyoming territory changed around them in the years that followed, the way the frontier always changed, with more settlers and more roads, and eventually a rail spur that reached Harlow Creek in 1883 and changed the character of the valley's commerce in ways both beneficial and complicated. The cattle operation on the Reed homestead grew steadily, 80 head by 1882, and Micah's arrangement with Josiah formalized into full ownership of the stable and supply operations by 1884, though Josiah still came in 3 mornings a week because, as he said, a man who had been in the horse business for 40 years did not retire from it without some negotiation. Thomas learned to walk in the cabin with its carved ladle hanging on the kitchen wall above the workbench, and learned to talk with the particular directness of a child raised by 2 people who valued clarity, and learned to ride on Dora, who had turned out to be considerably less particular about strangers than Caroline had originally described, at least the kind of strangers who were small and had a tendency to offer carrots. Their second child, a daughter they named Margaret Ellen after both their mothers, came in the summer of 1883, and she arrived with a quantity of dark hair and a disposition that was immediately recognizable as her mother's, a steady and observant quality that made people, from very early on, feel seen in a way they were not always comfortable with but always respected. The homestead had a name by then. They had not set out to name it, but it had acquired one the way things did, through common usage and the particular character of a place. The Valley residents called it the Wallace place, but Micah and Caroline called it by the name Thomas had given it when he was 4 and learning to understand where he lived. The coffee place, because the first thing anyone ever knew about arriving at that homestead was the smell. They were standing in the kitchen garden on an October evening in 1884, the year that Micah turned 37 and Caroline 32, when he first said it to her directly in those words. He had said it in every other available way over the preceding 5 years, in the building of the addition and the growth of the herd and the morning rides and the evenings at the small table, and the 2 children sleeping in the bedroom that had once been a storage alcove. But he said it that evening, with the October light going low and amber through the kitchen garden, and the smell of the supper she had left on the stove coming through the open window, and Thomas somewhere behind the barn with Edgar Bliss, who came out on Sundays now and taught the boy rope tricks, and Margaret on a blanket in the garden watching everything with her steady amber eyes. "I love you," he said. "I loved you from approximately the second cup of coffee, which you poured without asking, which told me everything I needed to know about the kind of woman you were." Caroline looked at him with those eyes that had gone from cautious to warm to open to everything over the years, and she said, "I know." He raised an eyebrow. "I loved you," she said, "from the moment you told me you were nothing in particular at the moment." Because a man who tells a woman the truth about being nothing in particular, when he could easily tell her something more impressive, is a man who has decided to start from the honest place, and there is no better kind of man than that. He thought about this. "When was that?" "The first evening," she said, "when you were sitting at my table with both hands around that coffee cup like it was the last warm thing in the world." "It might have been," he said. "It wasn't," she said. "You were." She reached over and took his hand in the way she had first reached over and taken his hand outside the church on the April day that Cross and Webb had left the valley for good, the sure, unhesitating grip of a woman who knew what she was reaching for. Margaret made an imperious sound from her blanket, which required attention. They went to her together. The valley grew, and the years settled into the full, comfortable weight of a real life, the kind built from daily choices and accumulated mornings, and the specific pleasure of knowing a piece of ground and a set of people well enough that the knowing itself became a kind of home. Micah took over the stable in full by 1885, the year Josiah retired properly to the house he had built behind the church with Ellen, and declared that he had done what he set out to do, and if anyone needed him they knew where to find him, and the garden was in every year by April. Edgar Bliss ran the day-to-day stable operations with the confidence of a young man who had been taken seriously at 17 and had grown into exactly the person that trust had expected him to be. Thomas, at 6, was a serious, thoughtful boy who had his mother's eyes and his father's patience, and who had developed an intense attachment to the cattle operation that Micah found both practically useful and deeply moving. Margaret, at 2, was entirely herself, a force of distinct personality who had everyone in the household and all visitors within her radius organized, according to her preferences within approximately 15 minutes of any encounter. Caroline's kitchen garden expanded in 1885 to include an orchard of 7 trees, apple and plum, and 1 stubborn pear that took 3 years to produce anything, but eventually came around. Josiah came out in the wagon in September to help with the apple picking, and declared that the valley had never grown better apples, which might have been generous but was said with such conviction that no one argued with it. on a clear December morning in 1885, exactly 7 years after Micah had first ridden toward the thin line of smoke rising from her stovepipe. He stood at the window of their bedroom in the first gray light of a still winter morning and looked out at the valley, at the grazing land with its snow cover and the barn where Calder and Dora stood in their old age with the good-tempered tolerance of horses who had been well treated for many years, at the fence line with its sound rails, at the orchard with its bare winter branches, at the smoke rising straight up from the stovepipe in the still cold air, and from behind him came the smell of coffee. Strong and dark and freshly made, the smell that had been the first thing he knew about this place, and the thing that had been the daily texture of every morning for 6 years, the smell of home in the most specific and complete sense. Caroline was already at the stove, the way she had been the morning he woke up on her floor and found the fire already built and the coffee already on and her reading at the table in the gray light. She was older than that morning in the small ways that years were, but she was also more completely herself, had grown into the full occupation of the life she had chosen and built and defended and cultivated, and she was looking at him over her shoulder with the amber eyes that had been cautious and were now something that had no single word for it, only the specific compound of warmth and knowing and chosen and home. "Coffee's ready," she said. He came and stood beside her at the stove, and she poured his cup first, the way she always had, and then poured her own, and they stood together in the warm kitchen with the cold outside making the windows white at the edges. And from the bedroom came the sound of Margaret waking, the imperious and confident announcement of a small person with strong opinions about the morning, and a moment later the lower sound of Thomas speaking to her in the calm, measured voice that was so entirely his mother's that it made Micah's chest ache every single time. He put his arm around Caroline's shoulders, and she leaned into him with the ease of years, and they stood and drank their coffee while the morning light came slow and clear through the windows of the homestead that was theirs in every way a thing can be yours, built and kept and loved through seasons, through winter and spring and all the difficult, beautiful years between. And outside the valley was white and still and enormous, and theirs as far as the eye could reach, and the coffee was exactly right, the way it had been from the very first cup, and the way Micah Wallace intended it to be for every morning he had left. Thomas came padding out of the bedroom with Margaret under one arm like a sack of grain, which she was tolerating with the pragmatic good humor of a toddler who had learned that her brother's methods, while unorthodox, were reliable. He set her down at the table, and she immediately demanded coffee, which she was not having, and the ensuing negotiation filled the cabin with the particular warm noise of a household in full morning operation. And Micah looked at Caroline over the top of it all, and she looked at him, and neither of them said anything because there was nothing to say that the morning had not already said better. The sound and the warmth and the light and the coffee and the life they had made from a blizzard and a porch and an open door, and the particular and extraordinary luck of finding each other already there. Outside, the Laramie Mountains stood white and permanent against the blue morning sky, and the cattle moved in the south pasture, and the smoke from the stovepipe rose straight and clean into the still cold air of another Wyoming winter. And inside the Wallace homestead the coffee was on and the fire was high and the family was together. And it was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything.